They called me ungrateful when I left home with $60. They called me arrogant when my name made the papers. But last month when I walked into their charity gala, wearing the logo of the company keeping theirs alive, they didn't call me anything. They just froze, because revenge doesn't always shout. Sometimes it shows up wearing a white suit and a quiet smile. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The heat hit first. Pasadena in June could melt the edge of a diploma if you held it too long. Everyone around me was laughing, hugging, taking photos under blue balloons that said Class of 2011. I stood by the curb cap in hand waiting for my ride. When the silver SUV finally pulled up, my father was still on the phone. He didn't step out. He didn't even roll down the window at first. I saw his lips moving behind the tinted glass. Saw the rhythm of his jaw clench the way it always did when something wasn't worth his time. He hung up, reached across the seat, and the window hummed open halfway. "Good luck out there," he said. He didn't smile. The air conditioning from the car hit my face like a wall. My mother sat beside him, oversized sunglasses covering half her expression, her mouth busy with gum. She didn't look at me either. My father handed out a folded bill, 3 20s, and a half-empty bottle of Gatorade. "That's all I got on me," he added as if it were a favor. The car idled for a moment. Then he shifted into drive, and the SUV rolled away, glinting under the California sun. I watched until the brake lights disappeared at the corner. My reflection shrank in the chrome of the bumper until it was gone completely. For a long time I didn't move. Kids were still taking selfies on the lawn. Somewhere behind me, a teacher called my name to return my gown. I unzipped it, folded it neatly over my arm, and started walking toward the bus stop. The asphalt burned through the soles of my shoes. I sat on the bench and unfolded the money. $60. 3 20s still creased from his wallet. Sweat dotted the ink, turning Andrew Jackson's face into a blur. I laughed under my breath. It sounded wrong, like air leaving a balloon. A city bus hissed to a stop. I climbed aboard, handed the driver 2 10s, and asked for a ticket to Santa Barbara, the farthest the schedule on the wall would take me. He nodded without looking, punched the ticket, and muttered, "Good luck." That phrase again. Maybe the universe liked a joke. I found a seat near the back next to a woman old enough to be my grandmother. Her hair was white and pinned tight, her purse hugged to her chest like something alive. She smiled at me once, the kind of polite smile people give strays. "Headed home?" she asked. "Not exactly." Then where I looked out the window. The parking lot blurred, then the houses, then the town itself. Anywhere that isn't here. She didn't press. The bus roared onto the freeway air, vibrating through the metal frame. I watched palm trees bend in the wind as we sped north. For the first time all day, the sound of laughter was gone. Just the low hum of tires and the whistle of air through a crack in the window. I took out my phone. No new messages. Not from my friends, not from my parents. The wallpaper still showed the family photo from last Thanksgiving, me in the corner half cut out of the frame. I deleted it. The screen went black. Outside, the sky shifted from gold to gray, the coastline opening up on the left. I could smell salt even through the glass. The woman beside me nodded off, her breathing soft and steady. I envied how easily she rested. I leaned my head against the window. The glass was cool, almost kind. The reflections staring back at me looked like someone I didn't know. Eyes too wide, shoulders tense, a line of dust across the cheek where my tassel had brushed. Maybe freedom didn't look like wings or open fields. Maybe it looked like a kid in a polyester gown, sitting on a bus that smelled like gasoline, and strangers holding $60 in trembling hands. When the driver announced Santa Barbara, I blinked awake. Night had fallen. Streetlights stretched long across the pavement, and somewhere beyond them I could hear the ocean. I stepped off the air thick with salt and exhaust. The bus door closed behind me with a sigh. I stood there, clutching my bag, feeling the weight of everything I didn't have. Then I looked toward the faint shimmer of the Pacific in the distance. If freedom had a scent, I thought it would be this. Salt mixed with fear, and the faint sweetness of something just beginning. I started walking toward the water. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and bleach, the kind of scent that stuck to your clothes long after you'd gone home. At Joe's corner home was just a thin wall away. A room no bigger than a parking space with a mattress that dipped in the middle and a cat I hadn't meant to adopt. I called her Freedom because irony helped the nights go faster. By 10 p.m., the dinner crowd had vanished, leaving a trail of napkins, ketchup smears, and half-empty mugs. Joe Rivers, the owner, leaned on the counter and watched me scrub a booth. She was 38, tanned hair pulled into a messy knot, always chewing something that wasn't gum. "Sweetheart, if you wash those any faster, you might actually afford self-respect," she said. I smiled without looking up. "I'm saving that for next month's paycheck." Joe laughed low and rough and turned up the radio to some country song about heartbreak. She'd been a waitress for 20 years before buying the place, and she wore exhaustion like jewelry. Still, she had a soft spot for strays, human or otherwise. Around midnight, the doorbell jingled. Caleb Monroe walked in same as he did every Thursday. He was in his 50s, hands, rough jeans, dusted with sawdust, the smell of pine clinging to him like memory. He sat at the counter, nodding at me. "Evening, kid? Evening, Mr. Monroe?" "The usual." He chuckled. "If you remember it, you're already overqualified." I poured him black coffee and dropped 2 sugar packets on the counter. He stirred one in, left the other untouched. He never drank both. Caleb liked to talk about wood the way poets talk about love, grain-weight patience. He'd once built furniture for boutique hotels until his health slowed him down. Now he took local jobs, small repairs things he could do alone. "You got sharp eyes," he said once, tapping his cup. "You notice things most people miss. You ever work with your hands?" "Not really," I said. "Unless you count scrubbing syrup off Formica." He grinned. "Different kind of polish. You ever want to learn, stop by my shop? Could use someone who actually pays attention." I thought he was joking until the next morning when he left a napkin with an address under his empty mug. I didn't go right away. I spent another week doing the late shift counting tips that barely made rent. Some nights I wrote in a little notebook, half sketches, half nonsense. Tables I'd design if I knew how. Lamps made from driftwood. Things that existed only in my head. One night, Freedom jumped onto the counter, knocking over the notebook. It fell open to a page filled with crude drawings of chairs. I stared at it for a long time, then folded the page and stuck it in my pocket. The next day after my shift ended at noon, I took a bus to the address. Caleb's shop sat on the edge of town behind a hardware store and a field of wild grass. The sign read, "Monroe and Sons," though there were no sons in sight. Inside smelled of cedar and metal. Sunlight filtered through the windows, turning the air gold. He handed me a pair of gloves. "You ever sand before, no?" He laughed. "Good. No bad habits to unlearn." The first time I pressed the sandpaper to the wood, a splinter stabbed my palm. I hissed, pulled my hand back. Caleb just nodded. "Gotta let it bite once. Teaches you respect." I wrapped a rag around my hand and kept going. The rhythm came slowly. Push, lift, breathe. By the end of the afternoon, I'd ruined 3 boards, but managed one that felt almost smooth. He didn't say much, just wiped his brow and handed me a bottle of water. "Not bad, kid. Come back tomorrow. You work." "I'll pay you cash." I did. Days bled into weeks. Mornings smelled of sawdust, nights of bacon grease. My hands blistered, then hardened. Joe teased me about my new wood perfume. Caleb taught me how to listen to the sound a saw made. When it hit a knot, how to tell oak from maple by touch alone. Sometimes he'd talk about his late wife or the son he'd lost years ago. I didn't ask questions. I just listened. He liked that. I think he saw in me someone who also lived in quiet rooms. There were evenings I'd stay after closing, sitting on the workbench, sketching in my notebook, while the radio hummed old blues songs. Caleb would be in the corner sanding something smooth, the steady rasp like breathing. One night he caught me tracing a line on paper. "That yours?" "Just a table idea," I said. "Stupid." He shook his head. Nothing stupid about building something that didn't exist before. That night I walked back to my room behind the diner, the notebook under my arm, the smell of pine still clinging to my clothes. I fed Freedom a can of tuna and sat on the floor staring at my hands. They were red raw and lined with tiny cuts. I pressed my palms together and whispered, "We're still here." The next morning when the alarm rang, I didn't groan. I pulled on my worn jeans, tied my hair, and caught the early bus to the shop. The sunrise spilled across the windshield, turning the world the color of honey. I didn't have a plan, but I had a pair of hands that finally knew what they wanted to do. By the time the sun rose, the shop already smelled like coffee and sawdust. I'd gotten used to waking before dawn, pulling my hair into a knot, and walking to Monroe and Sons, while the rest of the town was still half asleep. The shop was old, floors that groaned when you crossed them, windows clouded with dust, but to me, it felt alive. Every board and nail had its own pulse. Caleb would unlock the door, cough once into his sleeve, and grunt something like, "Morning." Then we'd work without much talking. I'd sand a chair while he patched a cabinet. The rhythm was slow, patient, like breathing. Somewhere between the scraping and hammering, the noise in my head, the anger, the shame, the what now, started to fade. After a few months, he let me do more. "You've got a steady hand," he said one morning, watching me stain a tabletop. "Don't waste it." One afternoon, a regular from the diner came in needing a bookshelf for his daughter's college dorm. Caleb was busy repairing a counter, so I offered to take it. I went home that night and sketched the design on notebook paper, erasing lines until the page nearly tore. 4 nights later, I had it built, a small thing, simple and square, but it felt like proof that I existed. When the man came to pick it up, I couldn't look him in the eye. My palms were sweaty splinters embedded deep. He ran his fingers along the edges, smiled and said, "Beautiful, real craftsmanship." I exhaled for the first time all day. Jo showed up later with a to-go coffee and her phone out. "This your first solo piece?" she asked, circling the shelf like a shark. "Guess so. Then we're documenting history." She snapped a photo before I could stop her, posted it online with the caption, "Made by a girl who refuses to quit." By the next morning, the post had dozens of comments, people asking where they could buy one. Among them was a message from someone named Lena Porter, who owned a boutique on State Street. She wrote, "Can she make 5 more?" I read it twice. Showed Caleb. He squinted at the screen, then at me. "You sure you're ready for that?" "No," I said, "but I'll do it anyway." He laughed. "That's the right answer." For the next 2 weeks, I barely slept. The air was thick with varnish and caffeine. I sanded until my hands ached, stained until my eyes stung. Jo dropped by with sandwiches, muttering that I was turning into a damn machine. Freedom. My cat slept on a pile of rags by the workbench tail, twitching at the smell of turpentine. When I delivered the pieces, Lena greeted me in a store filled with sunlight and soft jazz. She ran her hand along the grain of the first shelf. "These are gorgeous," she said. "There's honesty in them." Honesty. I hadn't thought of it that way. She paid me cash more than I'd ever held at once. As I left, she added, "If you can keep up, I'll need more by fall." The words chased me all the way home. That night, Caleb sat with me on the porch behind the shop, a mug of tea steaming in his hand. His breathing was heavier than usual. "You've got the touch," he said quietly. "Hands of a craftsman, heart of an artist." "Don't romanticize me," I joked, but he didn't smile. "Just promise me you won't let anyone take that from you. People will try, especially the ones closest." I didn't understand what he meant, not then. A few weeks later, he collapsed at the workbench. I found him on the floor, his hand still clutching a chisel. The hospital said it was his heart. When I visited, he looked smaller, pale against the white sheets. "Guess I finally ran out of wood to cut," he murmured. "Don't say that." He reached for my wrist, his grip weak but steady. "The shop's yours if you want it. Keep it breathing. Don't let my tools gather dust." I swallowed hard. "I don't know how to run a business." "You'll learn. You already know the part that matters." He pressed the shop key into my palm. It was warm from his hand. After he was discharged, he didn't come back to work. The doctor said, "Rest." Caleb was too proud to argue, but too tired to return, so the shop became mine by default. I cleaned it from end to end. The radio still played his favorite station, low and crackling. I changed the sign out front painting over the faded letters. The brush shook a little as I wrote the new name, Hale in Heart Designs. When the last letter dried, I stepped back and stared at it. My name, the same one they'd driven away from that summer, was now nailed to a wall that was mine. Inside, I ran my hand across the table where he'd taught me to sand. The varnish caught the light, gleaming like water. My fingers left a faint trail of oil and paint behind. "They drove away and left me $60, I whispered. "I'll turn it into 6 million. Outside, the wind carried the scent of cedar through the open door. I could almost hear Caleb's voice. Steady, patient, saying, "Keep building, kid," so I did. The convention hall in downtown Los Angeles smelled like new money and old ambition. I'd borrowed a gray blazer from Jo and ironed it twice, but it still looked like it had been folded in a suitcase for a decade. Around me, designers showed off furniture that gleamed like jewelry, walnut polished to a mirror-shine glass tables balanced on chrome legs. I felt small and raw and a little ridiculous, but the badge on my chest said Hale and Heart Designs, and that was enough to stand up straight. My booth was modest. A few shelves, a coffee table, a lamp made from reclaimed oak. People stopped, touched the surfaces. Nodded. One woman with a French accent said the collection had American nostalgia with modern courage. I didn't fully know what that meant, but I thanked her anyway. By noon, the heat from the lights made the air thick. I ducked behind the display to drink water when a voice behind me said, "You're the talk of aisle 7. I turned. A woman in a sleek red dress and heels sharp enough to cut glass smiled at me. "Sienna Cole," she said, offering a hand. "Public relations. I run campaigns for boutique designers." I shook her hand. Feeling the calluses on mine against the smoothness of hers. "Lauren Hale." "I know," she said. "You've got something special. Your work feels grounded, authentic. That's rare." She handed me a card embossed with her name. "Let me help you tell your story." Over the next few weeks, we met in cafes, her laptop always open, her voice smooth as varnish. She talked about branding exposure, the importance of narrative. People don't just buy furniture, Lauren. They buy a feeling. You're not selling wood. You're selling resilience. I laughed. I thought I was selling shelves. "Exactly," she said, tapping the table. "That's the problem. We launched a campaign called From Wood to Wonder." She arranged photo shoots, interviews, even a feature in a local magazine. Orders tripled. For the first time, I could pay rent early and still buy better tools. I thought she believed in me. Then came the gala. It was one of those glass and marble events where everyone drank champagne, but no one finished it. Sienna insisted I go. "You need to network," she said. "Trust me." At the far end of the room, a banner read, "Innovations in Design." Presented by Hale Developments. My stomach tightened at the name. My father's company hadn't crossed my mind in years. Sienna noticed my hesitation. "They're just sponsors," she said lightly. "Totally separate world." I nodded, pretending to believe her. When the presentation started, a man in a dark suit took the stage. The spotlight hit his silver hair, and for a second I forgot how to breathe. My father looked exactly the same, controlled, confident, not a single thread out of place. Behind him, an assistant rolled out a display. A coffee table. My coffee table. Every curve, every joint, down to the pattern of the inlay. He was talking about innovation, sustainable design, a new vision for American interiors. The crowd clapped politely. I felt the blood rush to my face. Sienna leaned over, whispering, "You okay?" "That's my design," I said. She blinked, feigned confusion. "It must be a coincidence." I stared at her. "Don't lie to me." Her smile faltered. "Lauren, calm down. These things happen all the time. Ideas overlap." "No," I said, shaking my head. "That exact piece was in my shop. I built it. You took the photos yourself." Her expression hardened. "You need to lower your voice." People were turning to look. My father hadn't seen me yet. I couldn't move, couldn't shout. The humiliation settled in like dust, visible but untouchable. I left before the speeches ended. Outside, the city lights blurred through the tears I refused to let fall. The next morning, I called Sienna. She didn't answer. Then I called a lawyer. He listened patiently, asked for proof sketches, dates. When I told him I didn't have any contracts, "Just trust," he sighed. "Without documentation, it's her word against yours. And if it's linked to Hale Developments, well, they've got lawyers who eat people like us for breakfast." I hung up. For weeks, I went through the motions, answered emails, finished small orders, but every time I walked past that table design, my stomach twisted. Caleb's words echoed in my head. "People will try to take what's yours, especially the ones closest." He'd been right. When I finally saw the magazine spread, my table under a bold headline reading "The New Classic" by Hale Developments, I bought a copy and tore it in half. Then I went to the workshop and smashed the prototype with a hammer until it splintered. The sound was sharp final. I sat on the floor, surrounded by broken wood and the smell of dust. Freedom circled my legs, meowing softly. I pressed my palms to the floor, felt the grit under my skin. Justice doesn't belong to the powerless, but time does. And time, if you're patient, can carve anything into shape. I turned off the lights and walked out, locking the door behind me. By 2018, the workshop didn't smell like survival anymore. It smelled like success, like varnished new paper, and the kind of coffee you don't have to water down to make it last the week. Hale and Hart had grown from a one-person dream into a small team of 5, and the name, my name, was printed on invoices that traveled farther than I ever had. It started with a local article, then a short feature on a design blog, and then came the email, Architectural Digest requests an interview. I thought it was spam, until Joe screamed loud enough for the entire block to hear. The reporter came to the shop on a Monday. I wore jeans and the same gray shirt I'd stained with walnut polish 2 years earlier. She filmed me sanding a desk, asked about my philosophy of craftsmanship, and I nearly laughed. Philosophy. I told her the truth. I build things that last because not everything does. A month later, the video went online. From 60 to a Dream. It was supposed to be a small human interest piece. It hit 1 million views in a week. The thumbnail showed me in the workshop, hair tied back, sawdust floating in the sunlight. The caption read, "She turned abandonment into art." I didn't mean to become a story. I just wanted to keep working. But the internet decided I was a symbol. Of grit, of second chances, of all those things people repost when they want to believe in hope. I kept my head down. More orders came in. The workshop filled with noise, the good kind. The clatter of clamps, the hum of the sander, the laughter of people who believed in what we were building. Then one afternoon, Jo burst through the door, waving her phone. "You're on TV, kid." I froze. "What, so?" She pointed to the screen. There I was, on a business segment. The headline scrolling beneath me. Lauren Hale, founder of Hale and Hart. The next voice of modern American design. The shot cut to footage of my father. Richard Hale Sr., in his spotless suit, sitting in his office surrounded by glass and money. The reporter's voice said ironically, "Hale shares her last name with the founder of Hale Developments. No relation confirmed." My father's jaw tightened. "She's using our name," he said, twisting it for sympathy. The reporter asked if he had any comment about the viral video. He leaned forward, calm but furious. "She's bashing her family to sell furniture. It's shameful." I turned off the TV before the anchor could reply. My chest ached, not with anger, but with something heavier, recognition. He still didn't see me as real, just as an inconvenience he couldn't control. Somewhere else in that same building I imagined my mother watching too. Margaret, elegant as ever, hands clasped around her coffee cup. She would have stayed quiet while my father ranted, but I knew her well enough to picture the tremor in her hands. And Emily, my sister, the golden child, probably asked the question that would hang between them for years. Was that really her? If I'd heard it, I might have laughed. A month later, I was invited to a gala for young innovators in design. The dress code said black tie. I didn't own a dress that didn't have paint on it, so Jo lent me one from her cousin's wedding. It didn't quite fit, but it made me look like someone who belonged in the room. The ballroom was all chandeliers and champagne. I felt more out of place than I ever had in my life. A PR intern pinned a name tag on me that read, Lauren Hale, Hale, and Hart Designs, and for the first time I didn't want to hide it. When they called my name for the award, I walked up the steps, the microphone glinting under the lights. I could feel the cameras on me, hundreds of eyes waiting for something profound. I didn't have a speech. I barely had a heartbeat. I was told I began that success is the best revenge. The crowd laughed politely. But that's not true. Revenge ends things. Building something new, that's what changes them. The room quieted. "So this," I said, glancing at the small metal plaque in my hand, "isn't about payback. It's about gratitude. To the people who left because they taught me how to stand." Applause broke out, soft at first, then swelling. I smiled, but my chest hurt. Because somewhere in the back of that room, just beyond the glare of the lights, I caught sight of a familiar figure. My mother. She was standing near the exit, her dress understated. Her hands clasped tight. Our eyes met for only a moment, hers filled with something I couldn't name. Pride, regret, maybe both. Then she turned and slipped out before anyone noticed. Afterward, when the speeches ended and the music started, people came up to shake my hand to say words like inspirational and brave. I nodded, smiled, thanked them all. But my mind stayed on that glimpse of her disappearing into the crowd. Outside, the city hummed restless and alive. I walked the few blocks back to my car, heels clicking against the pavement, the award heavy in my hand. I sat behind the wheel and looked at my reflection in the dark window. I didn't look like the girl they left at the bus stop, but under all the polish I was still her. The one who'd learned that silence could be sharper than any blade. I started the engine. The headlights cut through the dark, spilling across the street like daylight trying to break in. Santa Barbara had always been a city that dressed its mistakes in sunlight. The Hale Development's headquarters sat on a hill above the harbor glass walls, reflecting the ocean like nothing bad could ever reach that high. But bad things have a way of climbing. The first headline hit on a Tuesday morning. CFO Alan Pierce accused of diverting charity funds to offshore accounts. The photo showed him stepping out of his car as hidden behind sunglasses, reporters crowding around. The story spread fast. Within hours, the company's PR inbox was on fire. Inside the boardroom, my father slammed his hand on the table. We can't lose our reputation over one man's greed. The executive sat in silence. No one dared remind him that Alan had been his closest advisor for 15 years. Margaret was there too, seated at the far end of the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked tired, like she'd been rehearsing this moment for years. "Richard," she said softly, "the damage is already done. The public doesn't care about the details. They care about the story. You need to change the story." He turned on her voice sharp. "And how exactly do you suggest we do that? If we align with a brand that has integrity," she said, something modern, ethical, "people will start talking about recovery instead of scandal." The marketing director cleared his throat, flipping through a stack of folders. "We actually started compiling a list of potential partners this morning, companies with strong social impact reputations. My sister Emily, now the company's operations director, leaned forward. We need a fresh face, Dad. Someone younger, someone the media likes." Richard gestured impatiently. "Fine. Let's hear it." The director passed a folder down the table. "These are the top 5 recommendations. One of them has been trending consistently since that viral Architectural Digest feature back in 2018. He opened the page, adjusting his glasses. His face went still. Across the top of the page was a familiar logo. Hale and Hart Designs. Margaret noticed the way his fingers froze. "What is it?" He didn't answer. His eyes moved down the page, and there it was, in bold type. Founder and CEO, Lauren Hale. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioner. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he turned the page. The proposal outlined a potential design collaboration to rebuild the company's corporate image through sustainable architectural partnerships. Emily noticed his expression. "Dad." "That's her." Richard's voice was barely audible. "No, it can't be." Margaret straightened in her chair. "Richard, you know it is. You saw the video years ago." He pushed the folder away like it burned. "We are not doing business with her. Not after—" He stopped himself. "After what Emily pressed. After she made a spectacle of this family," he snapped. "After she used our name to build her own." Margaret looked at him evenly. "Or maybe she built what you refused to see." He glared at her, but she didn't flinch. "This could be your chance," she said quietly. "A chance to make things right." He laughed under his breath, a sound without humor. "You think a partnership fixes what's broken?" "No," she said, "but maybe it stops the bleeding." At the far end of the room, the PR director cleared his throat again, trying to sound neutral. "If I may, sir." Public sentiment toward Hale and Hart is overwhelmingly positive. Aligning with them could help restore trust, especially given the name connection. People like full circle stories. Richard's eyes narrowed. "You mean pity stories?" "Human stories," Margaret corrected. He stood abruptly. Meeting adjourned. The executives scattered like birds startled from a wire. Emily lingered, watching her father pace by the window. The ocean glittered below, indifferent. "Dad," she said carefully, "if Mom's right, this might actually help us. The board's nervous. The shareholders are already calling." He didn't look at her. "We built this company with our own hands. I won't have her name anywhere near it." Emily hesitated. "You didn't build it alone." He turned, then his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Drop it." When everyone was gone, Margaret walked over and picked up the folder from where he'd left it. The paper trembled slightly in her hand. The logo. My logo was printed in deep charcoal ink. She traced it with her thumb. Later that night, she sat in her study, the house quiet around her. The television played the evening news, Alan Pierce being escorted into a courthouse, reporters shouting questions. She muted the sound and looked down at the folder again. She whispered to the empty room. Maybe this is how it comes back around. The next morning, the file reappeared on Richard's desk. Someone, Margaret, though she never said, had added a sticky note on top. 3 words written in her precise handwriting: think before refusing. He stared at it for a long time. His reflection in the glass wall behind him looked older than he remembered, his tie slightly crooked, his hand gripping the folder too tightly. Down the hall, the receptionist's voice floated through the open door. Mr. Hale. The board would like an update on the partnership list. He didn't answer. He just sat there, tapping the edge of the folder against the desk, jaw tight. When he finally opened it again, his eyes lingered on the name. Lauren Hale, the daughter he hadn't spoken to in 13 years. His breathing quickened. For a moment he thought he heard her voice again, faint and defiant. Good luck out there. He dropped the folder onto the desk, the sound echoing in the empty room. I didn't need them anymore. But karma has a habit of finding its way home. Somewhere across the city I kept building, unaware that the wind from the past was already turning in my direction. The email arrived just after sunrise, subject line, proposal inquiry. Private client. No company name, no signature. Just a vague introduction about a large-scale redevelopment project in downtown Los Angeles. They wanted Hale and Hart Designs to lead the creative direction. Evan read it twice, his coffee cooling beside him. Anonymous inquiries don't usually come with 7-figure budgets, he said. I shrugged, still half distracted by the glow of my phone. They're trying to hide who they are. That's not unusual. He scrolled down to the attached brief, frowning. A hospitality project, full branding control, immediate start. Sounds corporate. Too corporate. Exactly. You think it's them. I know it is. He leaned back in his chair, studying me. So what do we do? I smiled. We accept. The conference room on the 30th floor of the Azure Tower was a monument to arrogance. Floor-to-ceiling windows, polished marble table, a skyline that stretched to the ocean. I arrived early in a white suit and low heels, hair tied cleanly at the nape of my neck. Evan stood beside me, calm as ever, folder in hand. Still sure about this? He asked quietly. I've never been surer of anything. The elevator dinged. Voices floated down the hallway, measured professional, pretending not to be desperate. When the door opened, they filed in, Richard and Margaret Hale, followed by their executive team. My father's tie was perfect, his jaw set in the same unyielding line I remembered. My mother looked thinner, her expression polished but brittle. Emily was there too, carrying a laptop posture, impeccable. They didn't see me at first. I was standing by the window, back turned, sunlight reflecting off the glass. Evan began smoothly. Thank you all for meeting with us. Before we begin, allow me to introduce the principal of Hale and Hart Designs, Ms. Lauren Hale. The room fell silent. I turned around. For a moment, no one moved. My father's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Margaret's hand flew to her chest, her eyes wide and glistening. Emily froze halfway into her seat. I let the silence stretch until it hummed. Then I smiled, polite and professional. Good morning. It's been a while. Richard finally found his voice brittle and tight. This is unexpected, is it? I asked. You sent the proposal. He cleared his throat. That was through an agency. We weren't aware that I existed. I interrupted gently. That seems to be a pattern. The air thinned. Even Evan looked down, hiding a smirk. Margaret was the first to recover. Lauren, she said softly. You look, well, thank you. I am. Emily whispered something to a colleague, but her eyes never left me. There was awe there, and guilt, and something else. Envy, maybe, or disbelief that I'd made it this far. I opened my folder, sliding the contract across the table. Shall we get to business? We reviewed the terms. Design, oversight, brand development, full creative control. Evan did the talking, steady and firm. My father listened, nodding when necessary, but his knuckles were white around his pen. This agreement, Evan explained, grants Hale and Hart exclusive authority over all aesthetic and spatial design elements. Hale Developments will provide funding and site access only. Richard blinked. You're saying we'll have no input? That's correct, Evan said pleasantly. The goal is to rebuild your public image through partnership, not interference. Margaret tried to interject. Surely there's room for collaboration. I met her eyes. You hired me because I build things that last. Let me do what you couldn't. Her breath caught. The projector flicked through images of my past projects. Warm, wood-clean lines, homes that looked like hope. My father watched, expression unreadable. I could see the reflection of the slides in his eyes, the craftsmanship he'd once dismissed as a hobby. When the last image faded, I reached for the pen. If there are no objections, let's sign. He hesitated. $6 million is a substantial investment. For you, it's survival, I said quietly. Evan slid the document to me. I signed first, then pushed it toward my father. He stared at the line where my name was written. Lauren Hale, CEO. And for a second, his composure cracked. His hand trembled as he scribbled his signature. Margaret watched him, tears gathering, but unshed. Emily closed her laptop slowly, as if afraid to break the spell. When the last pen stroke dried, I gathered the pages, stacking them neatly. Thank you, I said. I trust this partnership will be professional. Richard's voice rasped. You planned this. I met his gaze calm. No, you did. I just showed up. Evan closed his folder. Pleasure doing business. We shook hands. Margaret's touch was soft, hesitant. Emily murmured congratulations, as if she wasn't sure who she was congratulating. My father didn't speak again. As I turned to leave, I caught his reflection in the window behind me. Shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on the signed contract in front of him. His hand was still gripping the pen like he could break it in two. Outside the boardroom, the hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and nerves. Evan pressed the elevator button and exhaled. That, he said, was theater. It was overdue, I replied. As the doors closed, I glanced one last time through the glass wall. My father was still sitting there, staring at the paper like it was an obituary. Silence can be sharper than any blade. And today I used it exactly like one. The machines were still running when I heard the door open. Late afternoon light spilled through the high windows, turning the air into a haze of gold and dust. The sander hummed against the oak tabletop I'd been inspecting, steady as a heartbeat. I didn't look up. Most clients called ahead. Most people didn't just walk into my shop. Then I heard her voice. Lauren. It had been 14 years since I'd heard my mother say my name like that. Half question, half apology. I turned slowly. She stood in the doorway, wearing a gray wool coat, even though it was warm out her face, drawn and pale. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. The hum of the machines filled the space between us. What are you doing here? She stepped inside, her heels clicking softly on the concrete. In her hands was a thick envelope, the kind that looked too heavy for what it carried. I needed to see you. I crossed my arms. After all this time, that's the opening line you're going with. She winced but didn't turn back. I deserve that. I didn't answer. She set the envelope on the work table between us. You should have this. I stared at it, the brown paper smudged from her fingers. What is it? She hesitated. Proof. I said nothing, so she opened it herself and slid out a stack of papers. The top one bore my father's signature. I didn't need to read the rest. It's from 2000, she said quietly. The contract he signed with Hale Developments for the American Renewal Collection. It was your design, Lauren. I found the original sketches in his old files with your initials on them. He had the documents altered, forged your approval. You were right. I picked up the page, the familiar lines of my own drawing glaring back at me. My name, my handwriting, was gone. Someone had replaced it with his company logo. I'd always known he'd stolen my work, but seeing it in print made the old fury ignite like gasoline. Why are you giving me this now? I asked. She folded her arms, eyes down. Because he's not going to stop. He'll drag you down if it means saving himself. I can't let that happen again. I almost laughed. So now you protect me, when it's convenient. Don't, she said sharply. You don't understand. He did it to protect the family. That word, family, it landed like a curse. I took a step closer. He didn't protect the family. He protected his ego, his reputation. And you let him. She flinched. You think I had a choice? You think it was easy watching him erase you from our lives? Yes, I said quietly. Because you did it. Her eyes filled but didn't break. You can hate me, but don't become him. Don't let his cruelty turn you into something small. The air smelled like varnish and electricity, sharp and thick. I reached for the papers and flipped through them, each one, another reminder of everything he'd taken. My hands trembled, but I didn't want her to see. He's going to lose everything, she said softly. The contracts, the board, the investors, they're already pulling away. You could destroy him with this. I don't need to destroy him. I said, he's doing fine on his own. She took a step closer. Then what will you do? I'll keep building, I said simply. That's what I do. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks. You sound just like him. No, I said, meeting her gaze. He builds walls. I build things that last. She covered her mouth, shoulders shaking. I'm sorry, Lauren. I'm not sure I believe that. I don't care if you believe it. I just needed to say it. For the first time I saw the woman beneath the armor, tired, cracked at the edges, guilt etched deep in her face. It didn't make me pity her, but it softened something in me I didn't know was still alive. I picked up the envelope and walked to the small office in the back. The safe was behind a painting Caleb had given me years ago, a quiet landscape of the coast. I turned the dial, placed the papers inside, and shut the door with a heavy click. When I came back, she was still standing there, arms wrapped around herself. You're not going to use it, are you? Maybe not, I said. But I'll keep it, just in case. She nodded. That's fair. We stood in silence. The machines had stopped, leaving only the faint hum of the overhead fan. Do you ever think about coming home? She asked finally. Smiled, not kindly. I am home. Something inside her broke then. A small sound escaped her throat, part sigh, part sob. She straightened, wiping her cheeks quickly, pretending she still had control. Be careful, Lauren, she whispered. He's not done fighting. Neither am I. She turned to go. As the door opened, the last of the sunlight caught her face, painting her in gold and shadow. For a heartbeat, she looked like the mother I remembered from before everything cracked. The one who brushed my hair and told me that good people always win. But good people don't always win. They just endure longer. As the door closed, I stared at the envelope inside the safe. My pulse slowed. The air felt colder now. Forgiveness isn't a gift. It's survival. The machines started up again, the sander whining to life, as if the moment had never happened. The smell of oak filled the air. I stood there for a while, breathing it in until I couldn't tell the difference between relief and grief. The courthouse in downtown Los Angeles looked more like a monument than a building. White stone, tall columns, and cameras waiting like vultures at the gate. Reporters swarmed the steps, their voices overlapping microphones thrust forward, as if one sentence could change the world. It wasn't the kind of place I ever thought I'd end up. But then again, my father always said I was unpredictable. Evan met me at the entrance, crisp in a navy suit, his calm a weapon of its own. You ready? He asked. I've been ready for 14 years. Inside the courtroom smelled like paper and nerves. The air conditioning hummed against the heat of too many bodies. My father sat at the plaintiff's table, perfectly composed in a charcoal suit. He hadn't aged much. Same posture, same calculated stillness, but there was something hollow around his eyes. Margaret and Emily sat in the back row side by side, but with an ocean between them. Neither of them met his gaze. The judge, Nancy Reynolds, entered, stern, efficient, silver hair, tied tight. Everyone rose. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many people ruin their own lives for pride. Case number 25CV0321. She began Hale Developments versus Hale and Hart Designs. My father's lawyer stood first, tall and practiced. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Richard Hale, seeks relief for trademark infringement and reputational damage caused by Ms. Lauren Hale's unauthorized use of the Hale family name in her commercial enterprise. Evan rose smoothly. Your Honor, Ms. Hale's use of her own legal name hardly constitutes infringement. Furthermore, we intend to demonstrate that the plaintiff's claim of reputational harm is both unsubstantiated and ironic. A ripple of laughter passed through the gallery. The judge silenced it with one look. The proceedings began. My father's side spoke first, slides, statements, graphs about lost revenue. I barely listened. I watched his hands instead. They still moved with precision, but when his lawyer mentioned ethical misconduct and public deception, his fingers twitched. When it was our turn, Evan didn't waste time. He approached the bench and set down the folder I'd locked away weeks ago, the one Margaret had brought me. Exhibit C, he said. A contract dated 2015 between Hale Developments and a design consultant. The consultant's signature has been verified as forged. The design sketches attached to this contract match those created by my client, Ms. Lauren Hale, prior to the agreement. This demonstrates that the plaintiff not only misappropriated her intellectual property, but profited from it while discrediting her work publicly. The courtroom fell silent. Evan handed the documents to the clerk. I watched my father's lawyer flip through the pages, his confident expression cracking. He turned to whisper something, but Richard didn't look up. Margaret's hands were clasped in her lap, white-knuckled. Emily stared at the floor. The judge studied the documents, eyes narrowing slightly. "Mr. Hale," she said, "do you dispute the authenticity of these signatures?" My father stood voice-controlled. "Those papers are taken out of context. My former CFO handled that matter without my knowledge." Evan smiled faintly. "Convenient considering that same CFO is currently under federal investigation for fraud." The judge raised an eyebrow. "I'll take that under consideration." My father sat down, jaw tightening. For the first time he looked smaller, like a man trying to hold on to the illusion of control as it slipped through his fingers. Evan continued pacing slowly before the bench. "Your Honor. For years my client was denied credit for her own work, her designs stolen under her father's company's name. Now that she has built success independently, he seeks to take even that. This isn't about a brand. It's about ownership of identity." He glanced at me, his tone softening. "And sometimes the only way to reclaim who you are is to stop asking permission." The judge called for a recess. Cameras flashed as we stepped into the hallway. Reporters shouted questions. "Ms. Hale, are you suing your father back? Do you plan to countersue?" I kept walking. Evan's voice was low beside me. "You don't have to say anything. I don't intend to." I said. They wouldn't hear it anyway. When we returned to the courtroom, the tension was electric. Margaret sat forward, hands trembling. Emily reached over, touched her arm gently. My father didn't notice. Judge Reynolds adjusted her glasses. "I've reviewed both arguments. The evidence presented by the defense is compelling. The court finds that Ms. Lauren Hale is the rightful originator and sole proprietor of the designs in question. Furthermore, Hale and Hart Designs' use of her personal name does not constitute infringement under current trademark law." She paused. You could hear a camera shutter click from the back of the room. Additionally, she continued. "Given the evidence of forgery and misrepresentation within Hale Development's prior contracts, the court recommends immediate review of the company's leadership structure by its board of directors. Effective immediately, Mr. Richard Hale is suspended from executive authority pending that review." For a second, no one moved. Then flashes erupted. My father rose slowly, his face, pale lips pressed thin. He didn't look at me or anyone. Margaret stood abruptly and left the room without a word. Emily hesitated, then followed. The judge banged her gavel once. Court adjourned. Evan gathered the folders, nodding at me. "You did it." I shook my head. "No. The truth did." Outside, the air was sharp with exhaust and spring wind. Reporters surged forward again, shouting my name. I slipped past them, keeping my eyes ahead. Evan caught up, walking beside me in silence. Finally, he said, "How does it feel?" I thought for a moment, like breathing after holding it too long. As we crossed the street, I glanced up at the courthouse steps, where the last of the cameras were still flashing. Somewhere inside, my father was sitting alone at the table he'd once ruled from. They used to tell me justice didn't exist, that power was the only thing that mattered, but sometimes justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be heard by the people who were once forced to stay quiet, and for the first time in a long while, I let the silence speak for me. The invitation came printed on heavy cream cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that glimmered under the light of my desk lamp. "The Hale Family Foundation requests the pleasure of your company at our annual charity gala and family reunion." The words were smooth, formal, practiced. They didn't sound like an olive branch. They sounded like control. I turned it over in my hand. The seal was the same one I'd seen my entire childhood, an ornate H framed by a laurel wreath, the symbol of perfection my father loved so much. The irony was almost poetic. "Are you actually thinking of going?" Evan asked when he stopped by that afternoon. I looked up from the letter. "I'm not thinking. I've already decided," he sighed. "You know it's a spectacle. He's trying to look untouchable again. I know I said slipping the card back into its envelope. That's why I'm going. Malibu in May was too perfect. Sunset, burning the horizon gold, the air sweet with ocean salt and champagne. The Hale estate perched above the water, like it refused to belong to the same world as everyone else. Rows of tables shimmered with silverware and candles. Reporters lingered near the entrance, whispering behind their badges. I arrived just as the sky turned the color of melted copper. The valet blinked at the car at me, unsure whether to treat me as guest or ghost. I stepped out, smoothing the lapel of my white suit, my hair pulled back into a low knot. No jewelry, no accessories, just simplicity polished into defiance. Conversations dulled as I walked through the crowd. People recognized the name from the news, the lawsuit, the scandal. I could hear it in the murmurs. That's her. The daughter. The one who won. They didn't matter. I wasn't here for them. From the stage, my father's voice boomed over the speakers, practiced and proud. Tonight, we celebrate not just our legacy, but our resilience. The Hale family stands united, stronger than ever. The audience clapped on cue. Margaret sat near the front, perfectly composed in silver. Emily hovered nearby, greeting guests with a strained smile. Richard continued. And now I have the privilege of introducing the partnership that will define the next era of Hale developments. Our strategic collaborator, whose vision will help restore the excellence our name has always stood for. Behind him, the screen flickered to life. The logo appeared, 2 words that cut through the night air like a blade, Hale and Heart Designs. Then my picture filled the screen. For a heartbeat, silence swallowed everything. The ocean, the chatter, the music. Then a single gasp rippled through the crowd. Richard's face went pale. Margaret's glass slipped from her hand, hitting the tablecloth with a soft thud. Emily's mouth parted, eyes darting toward me. I stepped forward, the heels of my shoes clicking against the stone walkway. The sound echoed louder than the applause that never came. My father stammered, "Ladies and gentlemen." I reached the edge of the stage and met his eyes. "It's fine," I said. "I can take it from here." He hesitated, his pride fighting to hold its ground. Then slowly he stepped aside. I turned to the audience. "Good evening. I wasn't planning to speak tonight, but since we're celebrating new partnerships, I thought it was important to clarify something." Dozens of cameras pointed at me, red lights blinking. I didn't flinch. "I'm not here to rescue anyone." I said, voice calm and even, "I'm here to do my job, to build something honest." Someone near the back whispered, "Is this a joke?" I smiled slightly. No joke, just business. I could feel my father behind me, the heat of his humiliation pressing against my back. "This collaboration," I continued, "isn't about forgiveness. It's about function. Hale Developments needed a new foundation, and that's what I build." A few polite claps echoed, mostly from people who didn't understand what was happening. I looked down at Margaret, her hands clasped tight in her lap. People ask what it feels like to work with family after everything. I tell them this family is complicated, but work is honest. Wood doesn't lie. It breaks where it's weak. My father made a small, strangled sound behind me. I turned just enough to meet his eyes. "You taught me that, didn't you?" His face drained of color. The host awkwardly tried to regain control of the event, thanking sponsors and guests, but the energy was gone. I handed the microphone back and stepped off the stage. The crowd parted silently as I walked through their eyes, following like searchlights. At the edge of the patio, I paused. The ocean stretched out below, dark and endless. The same water that had carried away the echoes of every choice they'd made. Behind me, I heard the scrape of a chair. Emily approached, her voice low. "You didn't have to humiliate him like that." I looked at her, the little sister who had never once said my name out loud when it mattered. "I didn't humiliate him. I told the truth." She looked down. "He's not the same man anymore. Neither am I." When I turned back toward the tables, I saw Richard slump slightly into his chair. Margaret reached to steady him, her hand trembling. He looked at her blankly like he didn't recognize her. The reporters began whispering again, cameras clicking. I didn't stop them. I walked toward the exit, passing servers who froze mid-step, their trays shaking. The sky had gone dark, except for the fading streaks of red on the horizon. As I reached the driveway, I caught my reflection in a window. White suit, calm face, steady breath. 14 years ago, I'd stood by a curb in the same city, clutching $60 and a half-empty drink. My father had said, "Good luck out there." Now he needed me to survive. I didn't smile. I just kept walking. Evan's office smelled like fresh ink and victory. Quiet contained almost too clean. The kind of place where endings were written in tidy paragraphs and stamped with official seals. Outside, the Los Angeles skyline gleamed through tinted glass, every building pretending it hadn't seen the chaos of the week before. I sat across the long table from Hale Development's new legal team. Margaret wasn't there. Neither was my father. They had sent a younger associate, nervous polite, wearing a tie that didn't fit quite right. Emily sat beside him, eyes fixed on the contract before her. Her posture straight, but her breathing uneven. Evan stood between us, flipping through the final pages. This agreement, he said, confirms that Hale Developments will operate under partnership oversight by Hale and Hart Designs for the next 5 years. All design branding and sustainability initiatives will report directly to Ms. Hale. He looked up at me. That's you. I nodded. I'm aware. The associate cleared his throat. And, per the board's decision, Richard Hale Sr. has resigned as chairman effective immediately. Margaret Hale has retired from all executive functions. Emily's voice was steady but quiet. It's done. They won't fight it. I signed first, the pen gliding across the paper without hesitation. Emily took a moment longer, then set her signature beneath mine. The click of her pen echoed in the stillness. She glanced at me. You've got what you wanted. No, I said, capping the pen. I've got what was fair. Evan slid the final document into a folder. That's it. Congratulations. You've officially turned the company that tried to erase you into your partner. Partner is generous, I said. Let's call it dependent. Emily's mouth twitched, half resentment, half reluctant respect. You know, she said softly, Dad still thinks this is temporary, that somehow he'll claw his way back. I looked out the window, the sunlight cutting through the smog like a warning. Then I guess we both know he never learned how to stop fighting battles that were already lost. When the meeting ended, Emily lingered. Lauren, she said, as I gathered my things, I meant what I said that night. At the gala, you didn't humiliate him. You made him look in the mirror. I paused at the door. That was never the goal. Maybe not, but sometimes the truth does that on its own. Outside, the air felt lighter. The city hummed indifferent to the small revolutions happening behind closed doors. That afternoon, I drove to Santa Barbara. The hospital was small, nestled between eucalyptus trees and salt air. Caleb had been there for weeks now, recovery slow, stubborn, exactly like him. He was sitting upright when I walked in, glasses sliding down his nose, reading a newspaper. The headline stretched across the front page, Hale and Hart, rescues struggling development giant. He looked up, grinning. So the prodigal daughter saves the empire. Didn't see that coming. Neither did they. I pulled up a chair, the linoleum cool under my shoes. He folded the paper and set it aside. I told you once, he said, that justice takes its time. Sometimes it's late. But it always knows who deserves it. I reached across the bed, placed my hand on his. His skin felt dry, his pulse steady. I didn't want them to fall, I said quietly. I just wanted them to understand. I didn't need them to stand. He smiled. That's what real strength looks like. Not revenge. Balance. The window behind him glowed with the orange wash of sunset. Dust motes danced in the light, lazy and peaceful. I thought of the first day I met him. His rough hands guiding mine over splintered wood, his voice steady when mine trembled. You know, he said, after a while I kept a copy of that first shelf you built. The crooked one still holds my tools. I laughed. You kept that. Of course. Reminds me that perfection is boring. We sat in silence, watching the sun dip lower the world outside, turning gold and soft. Do you ever think about retiring? I asked. He chuckled, coughing once. Retiring from what? Breathing. I'll stop working when they pry the hammer out of my hand. Then I'll make sure it's engraved. He closed his eyes, smiling. Make it say, the man who taught her patience. The room grew dimmer as the sun slid beneath the horizon. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of machines and the slow, steady rhythm of two people who had survived too much to need words. Outside the window, the light faded into a soft pink haze. Our reflections glimmered faintly in the glass. His older, worn, but peaceful. Mine clear and certain. No one wins by tearing down what they've built, I thought. The only victory that lasts is the one where you stay whole. No need to destroy anyone. Just don't become them. I squeezed his hand once more before standing. Get some rest, old man. He opened one eye. Go make something beautiful. I already did. As I walked down the hallway, the sound of the ocean filtered in through the open window, a low, steady hum that reminded me of the shop back home. The sky outside was a deep, quiet blue, the kind that only comes after a storm has finally spent itself. The shop was already awake when I arrived, even though the clock barely touched 7. Morning light poured through the high windows, hitting the wood shavings scattered on the floor until they glowed like gold dust. The air smelled of pine polish and fresh coffee. Joe stood by the radio, humming along to a blues song, while Ryan sanded a chair leg earbuds in, head bobbing slightly. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just stood there with my coffee in hand, watching them move through the rhythm of work, steady, unhurried, sure. It was the sound of peace, not ambition, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself anymore. Joe spotted me first. "Boss lady's early," she said, smirking. "That's suspicious." I smiled. "Habit. Some things don't change." "Yeah," she said, wiping her hands on a rag. "But you do." I walked past her to my office. The safe was in the corner, the metal still cool under my palm when I opened it. Inside was the envelope, faded, creased at the edges. My mother's handwriting still marked the corner for Lauren. I pulled it out and stared at it for a long time. That envelope had been a weapon once. Proof. Power. Survival. It had helped me win in rooms where truth alone wasn't enough. But now, it just looked like something heavy that I no longer needed to carry. Behind me, sunlight crept across the desk, touching the edges of the papers. The blueprints, the framed sketches from my earliest designs. I turned to the small fireplace in the corner. It hadn't been used in months. I struck a match. The flame caught quickly, then steadied. I held the envelope above it. Felt the heat lick my fingers before I let go. The paper curled and blackened, folding in on itself. For a second, I saw my mother's face. The regret, the courage, the apology she never finished. Then it turned to ash. I watched until it was gone. I don't keep evidence. I keep lessons. When the fire died, I turned toward the wall opposite my desk. There, in a simple wooden frame, hung a photograph. It was one I hadn't shown anyone before. Me at 18, standing by a bus stop in my graduation gown. The hem wrinkled, the smile too small for the camera. I'd been clutching $60 and pretending it was enough. "Good luck out there," I whispered the same words he'd said that day. But this time they didn't sting. They sounded like freedom. A soft knock pulled me from the moment. Evan stepped inside, sleeves rolled up, a folder under his arm. "You're impossible to reach before noon," he said. "Do you ever sleep?" "Sometimes," I said, "usually by accident." He set the folder on the desk. "Congratulations. The European expansion is official. Paris. London. Milan. They want your designs for their flagship hotels." I blinked, letting it sink in. "They chose us." He smiled. "They chose you." I reached for the pen. The familiar weight settling in my hand. As I signed, the sunlight caught the ink, turning the black strokes gold. For once, the future didn't feel like something I had to chase. It was something waiting patient, ready. Evan leaned against the doorframe, watching me. "You ever think about taking a break?" I looked up. "From what?" He laughed quietly. "Exactly." When he left, Jo poked her head in. "Lunch run in 20? You want the usual." "Surprise me?" I said. She grinned. Dangerous request. I laughed. It felt good. Light. The kind of laugh that didn't echo in empty rooms anymore. After they left, I walked to the front of the shop and opened the big rolling door. The sound of the city rushed in. Cars' voices, the faint hiss of the ocean a few miles away. The breeze slipped through my hair, warm and familiar. Outside, life was loud. Inside, the saw started again, steady as a heartbeat. I stepped out onto the threshold, mug still warm in my hands. For a second, I imagined the old me. Barefoot on hot pavement, a backpack cutting into my shoulder, watching a car disappear around a corner. I could still see her, but she wasn't me anymore. They left me on the side of the road once, but that road taught me how to walk, then how to run, then how to build. Now I didn't need anyone to drive me anywhere. I knew where I was going. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of cedar and the faint sound of music from Joe's radio inside. I let it wash over me, closing my eyes. If someone had told that 18-year-old girl that silence would one day become her armor, she wouldn't have believed it. But silence had built my world. It had taught me patience, precision, peace. They drove away, and I learned to stay. They built walls, and I built a life. And when they realized what I'd made without them, they couldn't breathe. If anyone's ever left you standing in the dust, don't beg them to turn around. Thank them. They're the reason you learn to keep walking. They're the reason you'll find your own road. And when they finally see what you've built at the end of it, they'll remember the day they drove away. And they'll be the ones out of breath.